Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over the super powerful meta hunter builds. This is similar to the warlock builds video I went over in the last video. However, this time we're going to have a lot more options because hunters actually have quite a bit more variety, although I wouldn't necessarily say they have anything quite as insanely S tier as what warlock has for their best builds. Anyways, because of this, we're actually going to be looking at 4 subclasses, so this is probably going to be a bit of a longer video, but I do hope you'll still enjoy it. The goal behind this video isn't just to give you a build to copy and paste and use. The idea behind this is actually to give you the ability to make your own builds and make your own changes for the activities that you're doing. Solar Hunter is going to be the king of DPS for hunters 90% of the time, and this is mainly because of the super, but it also has some other things like passive handling and reload on using your dodge, and it just has a lot going for it. Currently, Blade Barrage with starter skills is the highest super damage in the game that doesn't require any other kills. Then if we go and look at the dodges, Solar even has its own unique dodge in Acrobat's dodge. This is basically a Radiant button for you and any teammates around you, and Radiant is a 25% damage buff in PvE, making it the same level of power as Wall of Radiance, and also better than Empowering Rift from Warlocks. Otherwise, we have the same dodges available in all the classes, with Marksman's dodge being the primary one I'd use for DPS, because it has the shortest cooldown, and it also allows you to reload your gun, of course. The cooldown is actually relevant here because of the aspect on your mark, which gives you increased handling and reload whenever you use your dodge. Solar has no unique jumps, so we'll move on to the melees. Solar actually has the most variety in melees as well. The lightweight knife is interesting because you are able to get radiant with it without using the Ember of Torches fragment. However, due to the amount of fragment slots we have, it's easy enough to just toss that one in anyway, so I actually recommend using Knife Trick. Knife Trick is pretty easy to hit, especially if you're fighting weaker adds. You'll even kill multiple at a time. It also applies Scorch for free, unlike some other knife types. And after that, we have the grenades. We have the same solar grenades to everything. I would recommend using healing grenades because we are mainly using a melee build here on Solar. And then we have Knock 'em Down, and this is the biggest part of this super being so good for damage, because Knock 'em Down is a direct increase to damage on Blade Barrage. In addition to that, it also gives you back your melee whenever you are Radiant and you get a melee kill, so this is also important for the melee build aspect, allowing it to also have solid ag clear. The way that Blade Barrage and Knock 'em Down interacts with each other is Blade Barrage throws 2 fans of 7 knives each by default, a total of 14. However, whenever you have Knock 'em Down equipped, there are absolutely no conditions to this. It simply adds 3 knives to each volley, adding a total of 6, so this goes from 14 knives to 20, which have no reduction in damage at all, so this is almost a 40% increase in damage for absolutely free. So if you are ever using Blade Barrage for damage, you must use Knock 'em Down to get the full effect, but whenever you combine Knock 'em Down and Starter Scales, you actually have the highest damage one-off super in the game, even rivaling the Pyrogales with Roaring Flames. In addition to that, we have On Your Mark, which again allows us to get free handling and reload. I believe this is 60 of both with 3 stacks. And you get this immediately for using your dodge, otherwise you can get it for kills passively. However, in a DPS setting, the interesting part is obviously on dodge. Having handling is great for any multiple weapon setup, and it just makes you increase your damage directly. As an honorable mention, we have Gunpowder Gamble, which has great ag clear potential and very good utility. However, it is very hard to pass up using the other 2, especially in a DPS setting, where the other 2 are direct increases to DPS, and this is not. However, if you are playing something where your DPS is not that important, you could certainly replace one of the other 2 with this, and have a great way to have good ag clear. In addition to that, the explosion from Gunpowder Gamble is counted as an ignition, so it benefits from all of the fragments, and it also staggers unstoppables. Using Knock 'em Down and On Your Mark, we actually have 5 fragments, so I like to use the Mercy Searing combo to get the fire sprites, which give us restoration. It's just a nice way to quickly pick up some healing anytime you need it, and it's just laying there on the field whenever you need to pick it up. You could also use it to start an Empyrean chain where you increase the duration of this. However, we also have healing grenades to do that on command. These 2 are definitely the most optional for the build. However, with having so many fragment slots, it's definitely something I recommend. Next up, we have torches. You'll need this if you're not going to be using the lightweight knife. That way you can get radiant whenever you hit something with your melee attack. That way your melee comes back every time you get a melee kill using Knock 'em Down. Ember of Singeing is also a great one. Sometimes Knock 'em Down doesn't consistently proc, and even if you get a kill, it will not give you back your melee sometimes. I notice this when I'm killing things very quickly. So I like to run this and also use the Gambler's Dodge whenever I'm doing ag clear using Solar. That way I can consistently keep my knife up at all times. Ember of Singeing is also going to be amazing in a DPS setting where you're using Marksman's Dodge, where essentially you could dodge and then throw your knife at the target, applying Scorch, which would rapidly increase the cooldown of your dodge while you're doing damage. This would allow you to get another dodge off and have even more handling, and also get another free reload. And last here we have Empyrean. Empyrean is the one that allows you to increase the duration of Radiant Restoration on yourself. This is pretty much just for the Infinite Restoration setup. However, if you don't have a need for survivability or you don't have enough kills to be able to keep this going, you could definitely opt out for something else. I would say that the Empyrean setup is probably the least potent on Hunter out of all three of the classes, so this is definitely not as mandatory as it was on Warlock for an Infinite Restoration setup, where that is the most powerful thing you can do on a Warlock. Hunters also have access to Assassin's Cowl, which is a great exotic for any melee build on Hunter. Basically, whenever you get a powered melee kill or a finisher, you get invisibility and a big chunk of healing. So this is definitely great on Solar if you're not going to be using the Empyrean setup. However, you should keep in mind that it's going to take away your ability to use Star Eater scales for DPS, so you kind of have to go back and forth about which one you want to use. Anyway, that's enough about Solar. Let's go ahead and move on to Arc. Arc Hunter, while not quite as good for DPS as Solar, still has a lot going for it for DPS, but it also has a much better ag clear setup and survivability setup than Solar in many cases. Arc has the normal Hunter dodges, however most of the time you'll want to be using Gambler's dodge for the ag clear, and then maybe switching over to Marksman's dodge before DPS. Arc also has the exclusive blink movement, however I actually do not recommend this in PvE, it's just not very good, you want a regular jump. Then we have the melee, we have Disorienting Blow, and we have Combination Blow. Combination Blow is pretty much just the better choice 99% of the time. While the Disorienting Blow is an instant blind, you can actually get blind using Combination Blow extremely easily too, and Combination Blow has a number of other benefits like healing you and also restoring your class ability on Punch, which is actually how you are able to do the classic Punch build on Hunter. One thing about Combination Blow also is that you get a damage buff every time you kill something with it for your melee. You get up to 3 stacks of this. Melee builds are mostly made powerful by having a lot of different things which increase the melee damage from different sources. This is mostly seen with Banner of War Titan, with it having several ways to increase the melee damage. Combination Blow acts as an additional way to have a melee damage buff in addition to things like 1-2 punch and other buffs, so it ends up being a very powerful combination. The grenade, I normally just use the pulse grenade as a default. If you want to do stun on stops, you could also use a flashbang. If you know how to angle it, you could use a lightning grenade. Storm grenades are also very similar to pulse grenades, so I just go with pulse grenades to be simple. And here we have Flow State. Flow State is alright, it's not really amazing because it's very easy to get amplified anyway. However, mostly you want to use this over Tempest Strike because Tempest Strike is something you'll accidentally use and just end up using up your melee and then losing the cycle of the punch dodge setup that we're going for. Just have a look. Tempest Strike is a alternate melee attack whenever you're sliding, which sends a little energy wave on the ground in front of you. It's a pretty good move in PvP, however in PvE you don't really want to use this because you're trying to use the punch dodge setup, and you can see it has an absurdly long base cooldown, and it also just doesn't really go into the build at all. So for PvE we're going to be using Lethal Current. And Lethal Current is where things get really interesting. You can see if you read it, after dodging, your melee attack has increased lunge range, whatever, but it also jolts the target on hit and creates a little explosion when you hit them that adds extra damage. This explosion has amazing ag clear, and the explosion also procs the jolt that you applied, so it will kill a lot of the things around the target you punch. In addition to this, whenever you punch something that's jolted, they are blinded, which pretty much makes Disorientation Punch useless. It is worth noting that some things don't count Lethal Current's explosion kill as a kill with melee. For example, you won't get your dodge back for kills with the explosion. However, it also will not use up your melee if you do this, because the punch is not what kills the target, and you don't actually lose the Combination Blow punch until you kill something with it. However, it is worth noting that Assassin's Cowl will proc off of the explosions caused by Lethal Current, so it makes it very easy to get invisible still. The Lethal Current explosion is also affected by melee damage buffs, like the Combination Blow damage buff, and also any others like 1-2 punch. We have Spark of Shock. This is just great for any setup. It applies to the grenades, however you can actually get grenades back very quickly by using momentum transfer on your gauntlets, so I still recommend using this even though we're not using a grenade build. After that we have Spark of Feedback. I pretty much only like this on Hunter because you're doing a melee build, you tend to get punched a lot, and this is a very significant increase to your melee damage if you are punched, so it helps you take down some bigger targets in one hit that would normally take 2 or 3. Spark of Resistance. This is probably the biggest part of survivability for this setup. in that you will pretty much always have a 25% damage resistance to everything around you while you're surrounded. So this is an amazing thing for any arc subclass in PvE. And my final favorite is going to be Spark of Amplitude. This is basically just free orbs from any kills while you're amplified, so it is a great way to add orbs to the team. It does have a decently long cooldown in 10 seconds every time you make an orb, so I still recommend using heavy-handed on your gauntlets for the melee build. However, this is just going to be even more orbs on top of that. Finally, we'll look at the super. Gathering Storm is something that was the most powerful in Season 20 when Jolt was king. However, Jolt has since been nerfed into the ground for DPS. It is almost nothing now. So this is no longer beating out Blade Barrage. However, it still comes relatively close, so if the activity you're doing would be better suited to an arc build, or if there's an arc surge increasing arc damage that you wouldn't have for solar, I do recommend using this. It is worth noting, however, that Gathering Storm is essentially a damage over time, similar to Vortex Grenades or Pulse Grenades, meaning that if you have multiple people on the fire team using them, you cannot have multiple on at the same time because they will not both do damage, so make sure that you stagger them out, and make sure that you only have one or two. It's also worth noting that for any boss with very short damage phases, Gathering Storm will likely not be able to get all of its damage off, which would again make Blade Barrage the vastly superior choice there. The main benefit to using Arc is going to be an increased survivability and a better ag clear potency, as well as having more survivability than Solar. However, it is very much so at the cost of its DPS to bosses. I wanted to take a quick second and thank everybody for all the support I've been getting lately. I've had some pretty great growth lately. Gotten over 200 subscribers this month actually, and also had a ton of people just watching the videos, and it feels very good. So if you are enjoying the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you for watching. Now we'll have a look at Void. This is probably going to be the shortest segment. It is also probably the weakest setup on Hunter. However, I wanted to mention it mainly for dungeons and 3-man activities where you would be less inclined to use Tractor Cannon because you would be losing out on 1/3 of your damage essentially. Normally, it is better to use Tractor Cannon for debuff in any sort of raid or 6-man activity. However, Night Stalker still has a place in Grandmasters, and it also again can be used as a debuff in dungeons, so it definitely still has a place in the game. The Night Stalker playstyle is very simple. It pretty much goes around invis and being a debuff. So we have the Marksman's Dodge to have the shortest cooldown on invisibility. Then we have the Smoke Bomb as the only melee option. This thing actually allows you to weaken targets. It's only a 15% weaken, however you can use it to extend the duration of Tractor Cannon. Using Void, we also have access to Echo of Undermining, which makes our grenades also have this 15% weaken effect, the same as the Void melee. So I like to just use Vortex Grenades. They're very basic and they're very strong, and they're definitely a great option. You could also use Scatter Grenades if you wanted to. They do have very good damage. And of course, Suppressor Grenades if you wanted to take out overloads with your grenade for whatever reason. Looking at the aspects, all 3 of the aspects are actually pretty good on Hunter. However, the big one is probably going to be Stylish Executioner, with the other one being the one that you'll switch out. Stylish Executioner is what really lets you build into Void builds using things like Deer Falcons, or any weapon with destabilizing rounds will also be able to set this off. Basically, Stylish Executioner will let you go invisible if you take out a target who has a Void debuff applied to them. The most potent example of this is going to be Deer Falcons, which is certainly the main build that people use for Void as general content. The other one we have is Vanishing Step. This is just a very easy way to go invisible. I recommend using this one for Deer Falcons because it's so very spammable and you can use it to kick off the chain very easily. However, to help out your teammates, Trapper's Ambush is also a great option. Trapper's Ambush is a way to make your teammates invisible by allowing your Smoke Bomb to make you and everybody it touches invisible. You also get a unique dive ability which does the same thing and consumes your Smoke Bomb. This is the build I like to use for Void. This actually is the same build I'll use on Titan as well. On Hunter, however, there is one thing I'd change. Using Starvation is great. Devour is very strong. Every time you kill an enemy, you get full health and a little bit of grenade energy. Definitely a very strong thing. We have Undermining. Again, applying weaken to targets always good. This is great for like applying weaken to something like a major or a champion where you wouldn't want to use your super or Tractor Cannon ammo on them. So this is definitely a great choice. Then we have Echo of Instability. This is how you can really get into having some Void builds with Void weapons. One of the more interesting fragments in the game for sure. Essentially, it applies volatile rounds to your Void weapons whenever you get a kill with a grenade. So Void builds are very often grenade builds. A very easy combination is just to use any weapon that is Void and has Demolitionist, where you can essentially get a kill with a grenade and then kill a bunch of stuff with your weapon while it's buffed up by volatile rounds, which is actually very powerful, and get your grenade back and repeat the chain. However, on Hunter, if you're going to be using Gear Falcons, I would recommend replacing this with something else. If I were using Gear Falcons, I'd probably use something like Echo of Reprisal so that I can get extra super energy and just spam my super even more. Finally, I like to use Echo of Expulsion. This is basically just more explosions, and more explosions equals more ag clear. It's very good, so definitely a top-notch pick. And looking at the last part of Void, we have the super. There are actually 3 options for Void, however, only 2 of them are even in the question here. Vanishing Blades is, for 1, a roaming super, and for 2, not a good roaming super for PvE. Pretty much the only good PvE roaming super right now is Blade Fury, and that's just because of the Banner of War and Synthocept stacking onto it. So this leaves us with Deadfall and Mobius Quiver. So Deadfall is essentially a single tether, and this tether is like made for debuffing. And you can extend the duration of both types of the tethers by killing enemies who are tethered. However, that's not really that relevant in a DPS setting unless there happens to be enemies standing near the boss. They will die as you're damaging the boss because tether shares damage to everything that is attached to the tether. That being said, for the most part, you're going to want to use Deadfall. However, Mobius Quiver actually has some very great uses because it actually does good damage and has the same debuff. So it might be good in a low man setting where you can make use of it. Mobius Quiver is a pretty interesting one because it has the full ability to debuff just like the Shadow Shot one, however it also can do actual damage. The Mobius Quiver setup actually almost does the same damage as Gathering Storm whenever you're using Star Eater skills. It is worth noting, however, that this damage won't show visually on the wipe screen, it will only be applied to the health bar. Essentially, the second volley doesn't realize that it is being affected by the debuff of the first volley, however, that damage is actually applied to the health bar. The difference between wipe screen numbers and health bar damage is a whole thing, and if you are interested in it, you can look at it, but to keep it simple, basically the damage that you see on the wipe screen is not accurate, but you can get accurate damage by analyzing the health bar. The issue with Mobius Quiver is mainly just that it is a little difficult to use because you need to time it out properly. Each volley that you shoot has a 6-second timer, which is half of the Deadfall timer, and you get to shoot 2 of them. This means that if you shoot the first one and then you wait right until the first one is about to end to shoot the second one, so that you hit it while they're still debuffed by the first one, you could use this very optimally. That being said, it's a lot easier to use Deadfall, and it will always work, and you don't have to put any sort of effort into it, and the difference is not massive. And finally, we are going to have a look at Stasis. Stasis is not very strong right now for the actual gameplay, however it has Shatter Dive, which enables the use of Shatter Skating, so it is a build that you will often find yourself using for general content, and it's always nice to have a usable build while you're doing your movement setup. And Stasis is still not a terrible thing, however this is not something you should be using during DPS, that's for sure. You can see we have the normal dodges, the normal jumps, and the Shuriken. The Shuriken is okay, it's not amazing, it doesn't do that good damage, but it does bounce between targets. So if you can tag a bunch of enemies and get them low and then kill them with it, it's definitely a great way to get melee kills and use Assassin's Cowl or something like that. It's not the strongest melee, but it's also not the worst. The grenades are where things actually start to get a little more interesting. Stasis has access to crystals, which are actually very good for getting around. There's some really cool shatter skating tech you can use, like by throwing crystals onto walls and then shatter skating off of them to get to unique places that you couldn't do on Warlock, for example. However, for the most part, we're using Duskfield Grenade just because it's pretty much the best in PvE. You could also use the Glacier Grenade and just spam that and Shatter Dive into it as well for ag clear. However, I like to use the Duskfield Grenade generally, and using the Touch of Winter aspect, we still get a crystal using it, so you can still get the increased regen using the fragments, which we'll go over next. Whisper of Torment is pretty much just the best fragment for Stasis. Grenades or taking damage, you take damage all the time, so you get grenades all the time. Very good. This is another good one for Hunter with Touch of Winter because, again, you get a crystal whenever you use a Duskfield Grenade, or you use crystal grenades as the other main grenade that you use on Hunters. So definitely a great pick here, just getting some free damage resist. I like to use Whisper of Fissures, even though it only has a small crystal and a Duskfield Grenade using the Touch of Winter. It still increases the damage of that, and also shattering any enemies, it increases the splash that they have. So definitely a great pick still for just increasing your ag clear potency. And the last one we use is Shards, just to get more grenades by using the crystal in the middle of the dust field or by shattering all the crystals in a Glacier Grenade. Another very popular build that used to be used was using Whisper of Rhyme and using the aspect for getting fragments out of killing frozen enemies or slowed enemies. However, Whisper of Rhyme was recently nerfed into the ground for no reason, so I really wouldn't recommend using this anymore. It basically just doesn't do anything now. But if you do want to give it a try, go ahead. You could run Whisper of Rhyme and then use the Grim Harvest fragment, which does actually have 3 fragment slots, so it's certainly not the worst thing ever. However, it kind of promotes a melee based build, and I would not recommend that with this because the melee has very low base damage.